If you ever stood on a wooden dock as a kid and heard that pull cord whine into life, you remember the smell. Two-stroke smoke drifting across cold morning water, your father's hand on the throttle, that blue lettering on the cowling. Evinrude, that sound carried you to every fish you ever caught with somebody you loved. And one quiet Wednesday in May of 2020, it was gone. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Now here's the part that breaks people. The engine that taught America how to leave shore did not die from a flood or a fire or anything anyone could point at and curse. It died because nobody in a corner office wanted to fight for it anymore. 113 years, 5 generations of fathers and sons, ended in a press release nobody saw coming, not even the village it lived in. Maybe you were 6, maybe you were 8. Whatever age you were, you remember the first time your father let you turn that little black handle on the side of the motor. The bow tipped up, the water peeled away from the hull in 2 white wings. Your dad's hand stayed on your shoulder the whole time, not steering, just there. The way a father's hand is there when he is trusting you with something for the first time. That motor on the back of that boat is one of maybe 3 things you remember from being a child that you would give anything to have back, and you cannot, because the company that built it is gone. You know what hurts most? It started with ice cream, a picnic on a little island in the middle of Okochee Lake, Wisconsin, the summer of 1906. 90 degrees, no breeze on the water, a Norwegian kid named Ole sitting across from a girl named Bess. She turned to him and said she would love some ice cream. So Ole did what any man in love does. He climbed into a rowboat and pulled on those oars for 2.5 miles in the heat, bought her a scoop, and pulled all the way back. By the time he handed it to her, it was soup in a paper cup. They laughed, they drank it, and on that long row home, Ole thought to himself, there has got to be a better way. That was it. That was the moment. Not a boardroom, not a patent office. A boy who did not want to disappoint a girl he loved. He married Bess that November. They had a son named Ralph. And while Bess held that baby in their tiny Milwaukee apartment, Ole was bent over a workbench, welding steel and brass into something the world had never seen before. He worked himself into the ground. His own wife had to bring a drawing board to his bed because he was too sick to stand. But he finished it, 62 pounds, 1.5 horsepower, a single cylinder that hummed like a sewing machine and could push a rowboat across a lake. Bess looked at it the first time and said it looked like a coffee grinder. Then her brother Russ borrowed it for a Sunday outing on Pewaukee Lake, and the next morning he showed up at their door with cash in his hand for 10 more. Ole built 25 motors. They sold out in a single afternoon. And Bess, the woman who had asked for that scoop of ice cream, sat down and wrote the line that would chase that little blue motor across every lake in America for the next century. Don't row, throw the oars away. You have to understand what that meant in 1909. Up until then, if you wanted to fish a quiet bay, you sweated. If you wanted to see your wife's family across the lake, you sweated. Water was a thing you fought. And then this skinny Norwegian came along and said, what if you did not have to? What if you could just sit there and listen to the loons and let the engine do it for you? Every man who climbed into a boat that summer felt something shift. Their hands did not have to bleed anymore. Their backs did not have to break. A whole country of working men got their Sundays back. But here's where the story turns. Bess never got her health back after Ralph was born. She tried. God, she tried. She kept the books, she wrote the ads, she ran the office. By 1913, she could barely make it through a day. So Ole did the only thing he could do. He sold the company he had built for her for $137,000, signed a 5-year promise not to compete, and put his wife in a car with a mattress in the back. They drove south through the warm states. They bought a 42-foot boat and crossed the Great Lakes together. And every night on that water, the man who invented the outboard motor sat without one, just listening to wood and waves, taking care of the only person who ever mattered to him. 5 years later, he came back. He had been sketching the whole time. And what he set down on Chris Meyer's desk was a motor 20 pounds lighter than anything on the market and 50% more powerful, made of aluminum no other company knew how to cast. Out of loyalty, Ole offered it to Meyer first. Meyer said no, said it would kill his existing product. So Ole walked out, took every dollar he and Bess had left, $35,000 to their name, and started over from scratch in their 50s. They called it Ole Evinrude Light Twin Outboard. Bess picked the name because she wanted a word like Kodak, something a child could say. Within 4 years, they were outselling the company Ole had been forced to leave behind. They had done it twice. 2 empires, 1 couple, all because she wanted ice cream on a hot afternoon. But you can only push a body so far. Bess died in 1933. She was 48. Think about what she missed. She never lived to see her boy Ralph build her husband's little company into the biggest outboard motor maker on the planet. She never lived to see a sailor in the Pacific in 1944 clamp an Evinrude onto the back of a landing craft and motor toward a beach in the Philippines. She never lived to see a husband in Minnesota in 1957 take his son out at 4 in the morning to teach him how to bait a hook. The slogan she wrote in pencil at her kitchen table in 1909 outlived her by 91 years. Don't row, throw the oars away. Every mother on every lake, every summer afternoon for almost a century. And she never knew. Ole sat in their Milwaukee house for 13 months after they buried her and grieved so hard the doctors said his heart just gave out. He followed her on a July afternoon in 1934. They are buried under the same patch of grass at Pine Lawn Cemetery in Milwaukee. The man who taught America to throw away the oars never made it to 60. Their boy Ralph was 27 years old when he buried both his parents. He had 2 years of engineering school, no experience, and the entire company on his back. Most men would have collapsed. Ralph walked into that boardroom and built something nobody saw coming. This is where the story stops being sad for a while, because what Ralph did with what his parents left him is the part you remember, the part your father remembered, the part that put an Evinrude on the back of every wooden boat you ever climbed into as a child. In 1936, he bought Johnson Motors and folded it into what became OMC. By the time you were a boy on a summer dock in the 1950s, Ralph's company was making $27 million a year. 9 years later, that number was $171 million, 6 times bigger. 9,000 workers, 30,000 dealerships, 2 airplanes, factories in Belgium. The 259th largest industrial corporation in the United States of America. And every single one of those millions of motors traced back to a melted scoop of ice cream on a Wisconsin lake. If you grew up in that America, you lived inside Ralph's empire, and you didn't even know it. The little blue motor your dad clamped onto the back of a Sears aluminum boat? Evinrude, the bigger one your uncle ran on the lake at the cabin, probably Johnson, same company, same paint, different color. The motor at the marina, on the dock, in the church bulletin where they raffled one off every 4th of July. All of it. There was no boating in America without Evinrude. The brand wasn't just on the transom, it was in the air. That blue smoke trailing behind a tin boat at 6 in the morning was the smell of being a kid. It was the smell of being trusted with the throttle for the first time. It was the smell of your dad saying, "Try not to flood it, son." Ralph married a singer named Frances Langford, and they lived on a 118-foot yacht. He retired in 1982 with sales touching $1 billion. He died 4 years later in May of 1986. And when they put him in the ground in Florida, the empire his Norwegian father had started with a coffee grinder in a Milwaukee shed was the biggest outboard motor company on the planet. That should have been the end of the story. A good ending. The kind of American story where the immigrant builds something and his son makes it bigger, and 3 generations later, you and your father are out on a lake at dawn because some kid wanted to bring his girlfriend ice cream. But it wasn't the end. Because while Ralph was being buried in Florida, the men who took his chair were already making the decisions that would kill what he built. They didn't see it that way. They never do. They saw spreadsheets, quarterly reports, and a brand that had gotten a little dusty around the edges. They didn't see your dad on that dock. They didn't see the smell. They didn't see the smoke. The first thing that came for Evinrude was the government. 2-stroke engines burn dirty. By the early 90s, the EPA was tightening the noose. You had 2 choices if you made outboards. You could move to 4-stroke, like Mercury did, like Yamaha did, or you could try to clean up the old 2-stroke and stay loyal to what you knew. Ralph's old company chose loyalty. They bet everything on a German fuel injection system called Ficht. They told their dealers it was the future. It wasn't the future. It was a disaster. Pistons exploding on opening weekend, cowlings blown clean off transoms in front of a man's wife and kids. 11,000 engines recalled because they could leak fuel and catch fire. A spark plug that cost $60 and lasted 50 hours. Fred Kiekhaefer, the son of the man Evinrude had fired back in 1927, said it plain. He said Ficht was a disaster, and he was right. Every Saturday morning on every lake in America, somebody was popping a cowling on a brand new motor that wouldn't start. And somewhere in the back of his head, a man started to wonder if the brand his father swore by had lost its way. The money ran out in 1997. The board hired Salomon Brothers to find a buyer. A real engine man stepped forward, Roger Penske of Detroit Diesel, $16 a share. The deal was as good as done. Dealers were lining up in Chicago to hear the new owner speak. They had a video ready, a Penske race car morphing into a powerboat. That speech never happened. A man named Alfred Kingsley showed up at the last minute. He bid $18 a share. He had no experience in marine. He had been Carl Icahn's lieutenant during the TWA bankruptcy, the one Icahn blamed him for. He was backed by George Soros. He won. Ralph Evinrude's empire, the one his father had built for the woman he loved, went home with a man who had never put a boat in the water. What happened next was exactly what you would expect. The factories started closing. Milwaukee, then Waukegan, where the soil was already poisoned with 30 years of PCB hydraulic fluid that had been quietly leaking through the floor drains since 1961. That ground around Lake Michigan is still a Superfund site. They are still pulling contamination out of the harbor sediment. Ralph's company poisoned the lake it was born on and walked away. On December 22, 2000, 3 days before Christmas, OMC filed for bankruptcy. 7,000 workers lost their jobs in a single afternoon, $800 million in debt. The day before, those men and women were building outboard motors. The next morning, they were standing in their kitchens calling their wives. 2 months later, a Canadian company called Bombardier bought the engine assets out of bankruptcy for $95 million. They moved everything to a town in Wisconsin called Sturtevant. 387 people went to work in that plant. They rebuilt the brand. They launched E-Tech, a clean 2-stroke that won an EPA award. They made it better. They believed. For 19 years, those workers showed up to that plant every morning and built a motor that carried Ole Evinrude's name into the future. And then came May 27, 2020. The village administrator of Sturtevant, a man named Gerald Nellison, was sitting at his desk when his phone rang. The voice on the other end told him there would be a press release at 4 o'clock that afternoon. He asked what it was about. Nobody would tell him. He hung up. 5 minutes later, his town watched on the news as Bombardier announced that Evinrude was finished, effective immediately. 387 jobs gone before the dinner dishes were dry. The factory floor that had been building outboard motors that morning would never build another one. Not the next day. Not ever. The village got 5 minutes of warning. 5 minutes for 113 years. Picture the floor that morning. Picture a 52-year-old man named Tom who had been there since 2002. Picture a woman in her 30s named Maria who had started 6 months earlier because her husband got laid off from the auto plant down the road. Picture a kid named Jason who had just paid down his first truck because the job was supposed to be steady. They had lunch pails. They had photos of their kids on the side of their tool cabinets. They walked into work that morning at 6, building motors that carried Ole Evinrude's name. By the time they got home, that name was finished. Not slowly, not after a fight, not after a fundraiser or a Hail Mary or a senator picking up a phone. They walked out the door at lunch, and the door locked behind them. And here is the part that I cannot get past. The part that I think about whenever I see an old aluminum boat on a trailer in somebody's driveway. Bombardier announced something else that same afternoon. They had signed a deal with Mercury Marine to supply engines for their boat brands going forward. Mercury, the company founded by Carl Kiekhaefer, the man Evinrude had fired in 1927 for being too stubborn. 93 years later, on the day Evinrude died, Mercury walked into the same room and took the boats. Let that sit for a second. Let it really sit. In 1927, Ole Evinrude himself, the founder, told a young engineer named Carl Kiekhaefer to pack his things and get out of his shop because the kid argued too much about how the engines should be built. 12 years later, that same young engineer used what he had learned in Ole's factory to start his own company. He called it Mercury. He spent the next 8 decades trying to beat Ole Evinrude. And on May 27, 2020, the great-grandson of the company Ole had fired Kiekhaefer from walked through the door and shook hands with the man who was burying Ole's name. Ole Evinrude fired Carl Kiekhaefer in a Milwaukee machine shop, and Carl Kiekhaefer's grandchildren ended up with what Ole built. There is no business school that teaches you how to feel about something like that. There is only the wind on a wooden dock and the silence where a pull cord used to be. You can still find them. Walk down to any old marina in America on a Saturday morning. There will be a man my father's age in a folding chair watching the water, with a 30-year-old Evinrude tilted up on the back of a boat he has been patching since his kids were small. Ask him about it. He will tell you that engine has been on 3 different hulls, started in every kind of weather, and never once let him down. He will tell you the new motors are quieter, the new motors are cleaner, the new motors are better in every way that a brochure can measure. And then he will turn back to the water and say, "But the old one started when I needed it." There is a kid somewhere right now who will never know that smell. He'll grow up on a clean 4-stroke and a touchscreen, and he'll be just fine. He'll catch his own fish and love his own father and make his own memories. The lake doesn't care which engine is on the back. The fish don't either. But the rest of us will know. We will know every time we walk past a boat on a trailer in somebody's yard and see a faded blue cowling with that lettering on it. We will know every time we smell that particular kind of smoke drifting across a parking lot on a summer evening. We will know in a way that we will not be able to explain to our own children, because our own children did not stand on that dock at 6 o'clock in the morning while their grandfather hand-pumped the primer bulb and pulled that cord until the engine caught. That memory dies with us. The company that made it possible died first, but for 113 years, on every quiet lake in America at 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a sound. It was the sound of a Norwegian kid who didn't want a girl's ice cream to melt. It was the sound of a wife who picked a word like Kodak. It was the sound of a son who buried both his parents and built an empire anyway. It was the sound of 387 people in Sturtevant, Wisconsin, who who got 5 minutes of notice. And one quiet Wednesday in May, somebody in a corner office decided that sound was no longer worth fighting for. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it's ready.